If a totally disastrous life brings you to a point of awakening, now, retrospectively, suddenly, it fulfilled a purpose of suffering in your life. If it still arises, use it so that the ego gets burned up by the suffering. So to speak, the ego gets burned up in this fire of suffering. Now we can call this conscious suffering. It's a very interesting concept. Conscious suffering, when suffering arises, become aware of it and accept that it's there in the form of fear, anxiety, regret, self-pity, an unhappy sense of self, or complaining. All your life, many forms of suffering, you've lost things, you don't know things you had identified with, taken away from you. Who am I now? I'm nobody. Well, that's great. Be nobody more completely. Realize fully you're a nobody. Mess, haha. I don't know who I am anymore. I've lost everything. All the things I've worked for are probably gone. Everything is so pointless. But as your mind is still talking, it's all been for nothing. It's all meaningless. Meaningless. This is your mind talking. Don't believe in the things it says, but it continues talking. Many humans in this world are suffering from what we could call nihilism. I don't know if you know that word, nihilism. Nihilism means the belief that everything is absolutely and utterly pointless. That's a deep form of suffering. Nihilism doesn't just mean, what's the point of it all? It's not just this awful life of mine that is pointless. The whole world is pointless. It's so awful. And that's very deep suffering, the total lack of meaning. Everything is arbitrary and random. Meaninglessness is a mental disease that is inflicting millions of humans. It's because everybody, the mainstream culture, still believes in it. It goes back to the 19th century. It goes back to Darwin's Origin of Species. Darwin said life evolved, which undoubtedly is true. But he said life evolved as an arbitrary, random course of events. Molecules and atoms at random, coming together and forming life forms over millions of years. Random. The idea of randomness in the theory of evolution, put forward by Darwin and others, means there's no purpose or intelligence behind it whatsoever. It's a random process. In other words, it's the belief that all life on this planet has no meaning. It just is a meaningless conglomeration of atoms and molecules. It's ultimately meaningless. That basically is the underlying assumption behind the theory of evolution that many people still believe. And it is saved into mainstream culture. And even people who have never even heard of Darwin have it saved into their belief system that we live in a meaningless universe. Before that happened, we had certain religious beliefs. So there was some meaning. And although a lot of that, perhaps, was ideological and ego-driven, nevertheless, in the ancient religions, there was access to the transcendent. Here and there were still little openings into the transcendent. Even though many forms of religion developed into ideological belief systems that strengthened the ego, nevertheless, religion still carried or still carries the secret of transcendence, hiding within the religions. That became inaccessible to many humans. So now we have the pandemic of nihilism. This is one of the pandemics, far worse than any physical pandemic, the belief that everything is meaningless. And you can have a meaning in your life that is very limited. For many people, the meaning is, okay, I want to have a career. That gives you limited meaning in your personal life. I'm working for a career. Nothing wrong with that. I'm working to create a better life for myself and my family. That's also wonderful and great. I'm working to achieve recognition in this world. That's fine too. But at some point, meaning that is purely personal may begin to lose its power. Let's say you've spent 2 or 3 decades working on your career, which is fine. At some point, you may arrive at a place where your career doesn't mean anything anymore, or you lose it. You lose your career and your status, or it consumes you so completely that you become ill with stress, or in some other way, it turns into something that's not satisfying at all. It actually creates suffering. Something can give you limited meaning for a while, for years, and then suddenly turn out to be ultimately meaningless. Some people suddenly wake up and think, my whole life. Some people fall seriously ill, and then they look back on their life and see, this was so pointless accumulating possessions. Why did I do that? What was the point of it? All the things I was so anxious about, when now there's, let's say I'm seriously ill now, all the things I was so anxious about that they created. What was that? That was so unnecessary and pointless. All the things they've been striving for will ultimately seem pointless. That can be an opening. Suddenly, wow, the limited personal meaning, which was fine. It's better than no meaning at all, can open the door to a deeper realization. To have a personal meaning in your life is better than no meaning at all. But ultimately, that's not satisfying in the long term. You have to go deeper to a deeper meaning that transcends who you are as a person. And that is, am I aligned with the purpose of the universe? That is the ultimate, true meaning. Am I aligned with the purpose? And what is the purpose of the universe? The purpose of the universe is consciousness, bringing more consciousness into this dimension. That's the purpose of the universe, bringing more consciousness into this dimension. Am I aligned with that? If that is the case, if you are aligned with that, you are a bringer of consciousness, a bringer of light. That is the ultimate, true purpose. It could be that your personal purpose and the deeper purpose can go together, that's fine. You can have a career, and yet it's not totally ego-dominated. While you are active working, you bring in the light of consciousness. You do things in your work that bring more consciousness into this dimension. That's wonderful. So you can have it. It's not necessarily a case of either having a career or being aligned with the universal purpose. You can bring the two together. That's perfectly fine. That's the balance between being and doing. As I sometimes call it, the balance between being and doing, bringing those two together. But the purpose, there's only one true purpose in your life, and that you have to discover. That is, am I aligned with consciousness? Am I a bringer of consciousness? So that's the end of nihilism. At that point, it no longer matters. Your entire past becomes relatively unimportant when you realize the meaning of life is to be a bringer of consciousness. Let's say your entire past was one disaster after another. Unfortunately, for some people, life is like that. Let's say you ended up in prison because you did one wrong and bad thing after another. You look back on your so-called life and think, my God, that was a disaster. My entire life was just a disaster. Okay? But at this moment, you realize the consciousness that you are. All the suffering you have created for yourself and others, all the suffering was part of the egoic dream, the delusion, the egoic delusion, and the conditioning that you came into this world with. Then you awaken at this moment. If a totally disastrous life brings you to a point of awakening, the whole thing was great because it suddenly has a purpose retrospectively. All the disasters brought you to this moment of awakening. So, in retrospect, what was totally absurd and meaningless suddenly fulfilled a purpose. The past can suddenly be realized as having fulfilled its purpose by creating the suffering that led to your awakening. How? There's no regret anymore about the past. It all made sense. Meaning arises retrospectively. It only remains absurd and disastrous if the awakening doesn't happen. Then you're trapped in the dreadful dream, continuing to be trapped in it. Wow. So, be aligned with universal purpose. That is the ultimate birth. No matter what you do, no matter how it expresses itself through you, that doesn't matter. But realize this. If you want to look at your life in terms of failure and success, as many people do, you might ask, is my life a failure? Is my life a success? How do you determine that? What criterion do you use for failure or success? Do you allow this world to tell you whether you're a failure or a success? To a large extent, this world is insane. So, are you allowing an insane world to tell you whether your life is a failure or a success? Haha. Well now, if this world cannot tell you, then what? Obviously, the only true criterion is whether you are conscious or not in this moment, purely conscious in this moment, instead of being totally immersed in the dream of your conditioned awareness, the fictitious person. If you are conscious in this moment, then that is the greatest and only true success that could exist in this life. Your entire past becomes irrelevant. If it has taken you to this point, in that sense, it is relevant, but ultimately, it's irrelevant. You're awake in this moment. You represent the awakened state of consciousness in humanity.
Wow.
That's success. Nothing else is success. Even if you want to use the term success, I'd probably recommend avoiding it because that would imply there's somebody there saying, I have achieved consciousness. Again, you'd create another conceptual identity in your mind, another form of ego that says, I am conscious, unlike all these other people who are not conscious. I have achieved something. I have achieved awakening. That's a delusion again. The that claims to have achieved awakening is the ego again, an ego that claims some kind of achievement. True meaning can only arise when the ego subsides, when it becomes transparent, and awakening happens. But it's not an achievement. There's nobody there to have achieved anything. It's something that happens through you. The ego, in some way, created in a negative sense, because the ego created the suffering that led to the awakening. In that sense, perhaps the ego did achieve it, but ultimately to claim, I have achieved awakening is an ego delusion. So, nihilism is a disease. It's a form of suffering that can lead to awakening, but it can also lead to despair, suicide, or bitterness. It may even lead to drug use and attempt to desensitize oneself against the suffering of meaninglessness. This epidemic of drug addiction we see today often stems from this root cause a desperate attempt to escape the unbearable weight of meaninglessness. There's a very urgent need for the awakening of humanity. There's a great urgency now because we are moving into a collectively critical situation on this planet. Awakening is absolutely necessary. Nobody awakens in their comfort zone. Nobody awakens when the conditions are what your mind might call optimum conditions for awakening. Nothing disturbs me. I get peace and quiet around me. I'm particularly wealthy. No challenges distract me from my meditation periods. Excellent food. Everything is pure and clean. 2 massages every day with essential oils. Fantastic conditions for spiritual awakening. Let's say you're in a spa where you pay $2,000 per day. You've won the lottery, so you go to this spa. These are ideal conditions for awakening. Would you awaken there? You might become very peaceful. It would be very pleasant. But you'd be like a plant growing in a protected environment, a greenhouse, with just the right temperature. The plant grows, quickly blossoms, but is weak. The moment it's put outside, it would collapse. It hasn't developed the inner strength to exist in the real world. For awakening, the challenges you experience in your daily life now are your best tools. They are the optimum way of awakening. Use the challenges you're facing in daily life. Don't believe, if I could only find an ideal situation, then I would easily awaken spiritually. No, you wouldn't, after some initial pleasant experiences in your imaginary space. Your level of consciousness would actually decrease. Gradually, you go back to sleep. The comfort would lull you to sleep. Presence only rises when it's necessary. Nothing comes unless it's needed. There needs to be a call for it. There needs to be a gap between the current situation and what is needed to remedy it. Things need to be difficult. Otherwise, change doesn't happen. Well, I think an empty chair works just as well as me sitting in it, because all meditation is about accessing the spiritual dimension within you, which the Buddha called emptiness. not the best translation, perhaps, of the original term. I think spaciousness would have been a better translation, or would be a better translation than emptiness. So, finding that dimension within you, accessing that dimension, and living your life with the awareness of that dimension, which means living your life with awareness, rather than just with the mind. So, usually, people think when somebody believes in God or angels or the afterlife that they are spiritual, it makes them spiritual. But that's not necessarily the case, and there are millions of people in this world who believe in God and have no access, have not found within themselves access to the spiritual dimension. So we are here, in the case of some of you who are perhaps new to this, so to speak, we are here for some of you to get perhaps a glimpse of it as you sit here and watch and listen. And I will endeavor to put you in touch with that depth within you, without which your life is frustrating, and without which everything you undertake, every endeavor, and every activity ultimately becomes frustrating. And for others, we are here just to deepen it, to provide a reminder on the conceptual level, but to deepen the dimension that they already have access to within, so that it can be sustained in everyday life. One thing is accessing the spiritual dimension in a meditation setting, like here and now. That's already a good thing if you are able to do that when you sit still and become still inside. Another thing is to carry that with you, so to speak, so that it is there when you live your life, when you do things, talk to people, and act, even when you think, to have that in the background. So we have the two steps. One could almost say phases. First, you realize that dimension within when you're not being disturbed, like now. Hopefully, you're not being disturbed externally, although you may be disturbed, as you say, by your mind. That's quite possible. You may think, what is he talking about? Because the mind doesn't understand it. The conceptual mind alone is not sufficient to make this a satisfying experience for you in these 30, 40 minutes. So, for this to be a satisfying experience, you need to have at least a glimpse of what it is that I am pointing to, and a glimpse also of that which underlies the words. And that's ultimately not in me, but ultimately, you can only glimpse that in you. There's a stillness behind the words as I speak within myself, and there can be a stillness in you as you listen to the words. And that would already be a glimpse of the spiritual dimension, the realization that on one level, you have the auditory perception. You're listening to the words. You have the visual perception. You're seeing this image. And on another level, you also notice that there's some stillness inside you. Wow. That's where the mind is not active. You don't need to think right now to add something to this experience. So you can just let it be as it is. And so the dimension of stillness, which is the spiritual dimension, begins to arise in you. Or another way we can put it is, you become aware that it's there. No, it's always there. That's the strange thing, it's always there, all pervasive. And yet, most people still don't know that. Of course, that's very much like telling a fish, there's something called water, and the fish says, we're. I can't see anything. Cold water, where is it? Can you point it out to me? And they say, we're. I can't see it. So this is my task to point out the water that you are swimming in and the water inside you. And that's the end of that analogy. As I pointed out at the beginning, the Buddha called the spiritual dimension emptiness, which would be better translated as spaciousness. And Jesus calls it the kingdom of heaven, which translated into modern terminology, if you change the word, kingdom. So which is an old-fashioned concept to a dimension. So which is a more modern concept, would be the dimension of heaven. And you can even translate heaven into a more modern concept to make it work for you as a pointer. So, what is heaven? In some words, heaven and sky are the same word in some languages. What is the sky or the heaven? It's spaciousness. The dimension of spaciousness is the kingdom of heaven. So the Buddha calls it that. Jesus calls it that. And Time magazine calls it mumbo jumbo. It's also true from the perspective of the conceptualizing mind, because if you're totally trapped in concepts, in thoughts, then it makes no sense. And the only thing you can conceive of as spiritual is some belief system, you say. All these people have belief systems. These spiritual people have all kinds of weird beliefs, and it's not that at all. So it's already there. It's already present within you. The strange thing is, it's continuously overlooked because your attention is drawn into sensory perceptions. Experiencing with your senses, reaching out with your senses, listening, touching, smelling, seeing. Everything demands your attention. And then your attention is drawn even more strongly to the interpretations of your mind. In other words, thought activity, which actually can make you forget a large part of sensory perception. In modern humans, contemporary humans, there's more thought activity in them than sensory perceptions. So you're being drawn into sensory perception, even more so into mind activity, and then also drawn into emotions that accompany mind activity. So your life consists basically of 3 levels: sense perceptions, thoughts, and emotions. What's overlooked is the deeper dimension within which all 3 others exist. That's the spaciousness within you. It's always there. It's just a question of redirecting your attention to it. But that's not absolutely right to say that. But unfortunately, language works like that. As you sit here, let's just go through it again. You're aware of sense perceptions, especially visual and auditory, yes. There may be some thoughts arising in your mind now. Whatever thoughts arise in your mind here, no, obviously, are quite irrelevant. But that's another matter. There may be thoughts arising in your mind from time to time. So you're listening and you're thinking. What's he driving at? When are we going to start our meditation? Etc. Mumbo jumbo, thoughts come and go. And you may have emotions restlessness, perhaps, or you may think about tomorrow. What's going to happen when I go there tomorrow? And you have an emotion to associate with that. So as we sit here, notice that these levels are operating in you. And then you could ask yourself, who or what is it that notices these things? Who or what is it in me that notices that there are sense perceptions? What is it in me that is aware of sense perceptions? Aware that there are thoughts. Aware that there's an emotion. And that's who you are at the level of the deeper level of the transcendent, or the spiritual dimension, the awareness of all this, the still spacious consciousness in the background, so to speak. You could call it, just to briefly use an analogy, in a way, the canvas on which your life is drawn, painted. And an ancient question in spirituality is the question, who am I? And if you look closely, you see that you're not your thoughts. You're not your sense perceptions. You're not your emotions. They come and go. What remains is consciousness, awareness. That's the water that the fish didn't know about. As far as you are concerned, that is. And it's an amazing thing to realize that there are greater depths in you than your surface life that consists of sense perceptions, thoughts, and emotions. They come together in different forms. So every human has a slightly different story of the coming together of sense perceptions, thoughts, and emotions to form the human being, the person. And they come together in each person in a slightly or very different way. So it's a coming together of this that creates the temporary form that we call the person. But that can only exist in the light of consciousness. Without that, there's nobody, nothing there. So your life is a little bit like this. You're watching the screen, let's say another analogy. A cinema screen. All kinds of things happen there. Of course, the screen is inside you. So, okay, let's imagine that there's a screen inside your mind. And on that screen, your life is being enacted with thoughts and emotions, and things happening, drama and this and that. And, oh, it's so interesting, or it's so dreadful, or I can't stand it anymore, or I want more of it. I haven't had enough yet, and so on. And suddenly you realize that there's a screen that's inside you, and you are the projector. You are the light of the projector. And that changes, of course, fundamentally, the way in which you relate to the events on the screen. How does it do that? Well, you can see for yourself. If you see that you are the light of projector, it adds this dimension of awareness to what you are witnessing on the screen. It gives you a certain detachment from what happens because you realize that there is something much more essential or fundamental in you than all the things that are going on in that screen. And if you don't know that, you are totally drawn into the events on the screen. And for most people, sooner or later, the events on the screen turn into some kind of drama. Nothing lasts for very long. There's no real security in life. Why do things always have to be so frustrating? But then, you always look for more on the screen. You look for some kind of solution on the screen. It's never this. Pseudo solutions come from time to time and happy moments. And then again, it's over. That's because you don't know who you are or what you are. But it doesn't matter whether we call it who or what. Who or what you are essentially, which is the light of consciousness, which is the projector, can be sensed within you at any moment, like now, as an aware presence. Most of the time, there is a voice in your head that comments and has opinions, viewpoints, and interpretations about what's going on in your life. I call that the voice in the head. For most humans, that is completely involuntary. They don't even know that they have a voice in the head that never stops talking, most of the time silently in your head. At other times, it may even shout something out so it wants to be heard. If you walk in the street, you will find most people look fairly sane. They're not talking to themselves. It seems because they're not talking out aloud. But if you listen into everybody's head, you would be amazed at how noisy the inside of every human is. It's like a radio. You know these radio stations where the people talk in an excited voice and they go on and on. If you go to a foreign country and you don't know what they're talking about, you might think, this must be extremely important. But if you can understand what they are saying, you realize it's completely meaningless. It's just noise. So, a significant part of what happens in your mind, the larger part, is actually just superfluous noise. Thinking is a wonderful ability, a wonderful tool if used rightly. It is an instrument that causes dysfunction and misery for millions on the planet, unhappiness for millions if thinking not used but instead uses you. When humans say, I think in most cases, that's actually not true because they have no control over their thinking. It's compulsive and involuntary. They are so identified with these thought processes that they don't even know they are in the grip of them. Because they are so identified, they become their thought processes. So, whatever comes into your head, you completely believe in it, and then you think, yeah, that's how it is. Leon just mentioned, I don't know, we were talking this morning about yesterday, about when I was struggling to survive on a physical plane. I often ate baked beans on toast. I was living in England. There's a little bit of relevance here too. That could have been a very unhappy period in my life, not knowing what to live on the next day or the day after. Now I'm able to have good meals occasionally, and I haven't had baked beans on toast in a long time now. But Leon gave me a can yesterday, when I was reduced to eating baked beans on toast, and again, that's a wrong way of putting it. It could have been very unhappy. I was already in my 30s. My mind, my mental commentary, the involuntary thought processes would normally have said, this is your complete failure. You can't afford the rent. You don't know, you have no income. You've made a mess out of your life. And this is what you've been reduced to baked beans on toast. Look at your contemporaries, they're driving around in their BMWs. They've got all that. And this is what life has done to me, or what I have done to mess up my life. I could have had many kinds of narratives accompanying what was happening in the present moment that would have created unhappiness. And I wouldn't even have known it. That happens. This is just a small example of how a narrative that you have that accompanies something you are doing causes unhappiness. You can do the same thing without the narrative, and you're free of unhappiness. You're eating baked beans on toast, and actually, it doesn't taste that bad at all. You swallow, and it is nourishing. You don't even have to say that. You can simply enjoy the sensory perceptions associated with it without building a sense of self around it. The sense of self that you build arises through involuntary and compulsive thinking. Me and the Buddha were already talking about that. I'm saying this now in case you need to leave early or want to go across the street. If you only take this away from this evening, but hopefully there will be much more whenever you feel unhappiness. This is a generic term, unhappiness in whatever form. Unhappiness can arise as irritation, anger, or even boredom. Sadness, all kinds of states that don't feel pleasant, are unhappiness. Usually, they are attributed to a life situation, something that's going on in your life. For example, waiting at the airline counter. Of course, how often things don't go well there. Let's hope they don't drag you out of the plane, but that could happen too. Whenever you feel irritation, anger, or upset in whatever form, ask yourself, is this caused by the situation? Or is it caused by what my mind is telling me about the situation? In 95% of cases, you will find that the mental commentary that argues and complains about something going on that shouldn't be going on. But it is the cause. The gap between what is and what the mind says should be or shouldn't be, that gap is the arising of unhappiness and misery. Or as the Buddha called it, suffering. It arises in the gap between the isness of things in this moment and the arguing with the isness of things in this moment, imposing a narrative on it that says, no, this should not be. I'm not talking about situations where you can take action to change them. There are certain situations where action is possible and necessary, it's fine. But even if action is possible and necessary, at this very moment, it still is as it is. Then you can take action, but this moment is as it is. When you allow this moment to be as it is because you recognize the inevitability of it, it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious to most humans. Recognize the inevitability of what is already the case now. If you can internally align yourself with this inevitable now, the next moment is a different thing. But when the next moment comes, it's now, of course. There's no next moment except as a thought in the head. Where is the future? You've never experienced it, you can't. Impossible. And yet, humans think about it more than the present moment. They want to get to the future because they don't want what is. They believe some kind of liberation or fulfillment will come next, always missing the isness of things. So, if unhappiness arises, examine it. Is it caused by the situation I'm in? Or is it caused by how my mind is interpreting the situation?